Before I begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever cried so quietly you were scared someone would hear, even though no one was listening anyway? My name is Lena, and this is my story. If you're here, it's not by accident. Please take a moment to subscribe to my channel because what you're about to hear isn't just pain, it's proof that we can survive it. Now close your eyes and just listen. The first time I remember crying myself to sleep, I was 6 years old, curled into the farthest corner of my bed, pressing my face so hard into the pillow it felt like I could melt into it and disappear. I wasn't even sure what I was crying about anymore, whether it was the way my mother didn't look at me when I asked her if she loved me, or the sound of my father's voice downstairs turning thick with anger after his fourth beer, or maybe just the growing sense inside me that love was something I'd heard about but never really met. Our house looked beautiful from the outside, 2 stories, a flower box, a white picket fence, but inside, it was a haunted place and I was its smallest ghost. Every night followed the same ritual. Pretend to be asleep before Dad slammed the door. Don't make a sound when Mom argues back. Cover your ears during the silence that always came before the crash. I memorized the rhythm of the chaos, knew exactly how long it would take before something shattered, how quickly Mom would stop defending herself and fall into her own silence. I knew when the silence meant rage and when it meant regret. I never really slept in that house. I hid in unconsciousness. My bed was not comfort, it was camouflage. And my tears were not weakness. They were the only part of me still alive enough to feel. School was no different. I smiled just enough to make them think I was fine. My teachers called me polite and quiet. The other kids called me weird. I kept my sleeves long, even in summer. Not because of bruises, I learned early to avoid the physical stuff, but because my skin felt like paper, and I didn't want the world to see the scribbles written all over me in invisible ink. I would come home to my mother's silence and my father's unpredictable shadows, and I learned to tiptoe between them like landmines. Sometimes he would be sweet by me, a doll, say I was his little princess, but sweetness in our home always came with strings. I stopped liking gifts. I started fearing kindness. It never lasted. And the worst part? I began to believe it was my fault. That if I were better, quieter, smarter, more lovable, maybe my mother would smile. Maybe my father would come home sober. Maybe the house would feel like a place instead of a punishment. But no matter how hard I tried, the crying at night never stopped. By the time I was 11, I had developed the art of emotional vanishing. I could sit through an entire dinner without making eye contact. Speak only when spoken to, laugh at the right moments so no one would ask questions, but the tears still came every night, quiet, burning, unforgiving tears that left salt stains on my pillow and hollow spaces in my chest. I wrote in a journal that I hid behind the wall panel under my bed. I don't think I'm a person. I think I'm just a shadow wearing clothes. One day, my mother found it. She didn't get angry, she just looked at me with empty eyes and said, "You shouldn't think like this. What if someone reads it? Not I'm sorry you feel this way, not let's talk about it, just hide it better next time." And so I did. I hid everything, my fear, my questions, my dreams, especially my dreams. I used to dream of becoming a poet, of standing on stage and reading words that made people cry the way I did at night, but not from pain, from understanding. But in our house, dreams were a luxury, and I was too busy surviving. At 13, the night terrors began. I'd wake up gasping, sweating, convinced I had screamed out loud. Sometimes I had. My mother would come in and shush me, never hug me, never ask what the nightmare was about, just tell me to stop scaring my father. I became afraid of sleep itself. The crying got worse, but quieter. By 15, I was the girl everyone forgot to notice, not bullied, not adored, just invisible. And maybe that was safer. Because when people looked too close, they started asking questions, and questions could lead to truth. And the truth could destroy everything. At 17, I met someone who said he saw me, really saw me. He was older, kind, calm, said all the right things. And for a few weeks, I thought maybe this was the start of a different story. But pain recognizes pain, and sometimes it repeats it. He became controlling, then cold, then cruel. Not with fists, but with silence, with shame. I was already used to being blamed for everything. So when he started doing it, I didn't even flinch. It felt familiar. That's the worst part, how easily we accept pain when it wears a face we know. I cried every night in his apartment too. Different rooms, same tears. But something started changing, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. One night I looked in the mirror and said to myself, what if this isn't love? What if love isn't supposed to feel like this? It was the first rebellious thought I'd had in years. And it terrified me, but it also sparked something. A flicker. A whisper. A question. What if I deserve more? That question became a sentence. That sentence became a plan. And one morning, while he was still asleep, I left. I walked away from everything. I didn't even cry that night. I just stared at the ceiling in a cheap shelter room and waited for the tears to come. But they didn't. I was too numb, too tired, too free. I didn't know what it was yet, but it was different. And that difference, however fragile, became my anchor. The crying didn't stop immediately, but it began to lessen. And now, years later now, I sleep. I sleep without fear, without flinching, without checking the locks 4 times. And sometimes I still cry, but not because I'm broken. Because I survived. Because I finally found peace. And in this story, peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the proof that I made it through. The morning after I left, I woke up in a twin bed that creaked with every breath I took, beneath a faded floral blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and dust, in a room where the air felt too quiet, too foreign, too clean. It wasn't home at least, not yet, but it wasn't hell either. And that alone made it feel like a miracle. The shelter was small and old, a converted house with thin walls, chipped paint, and a front porch with a rocking chair no one sat in, but for me it felt like a sanctuary. There were 5 other women living there, all survivors like me, each with their own version of horror tucked behind tired eyes and polite smiles. At first, we didn't talk much. We passed each other in the hallways with nods and half-muttered greetings. But trauma has a way of recognizing itself. It waits quietly until one person opens a window, and then suddenly the whole house starts to breathe. It started with Ruth, a woman in her 60s who wore long skirts and hummingbird earrings. One morning she made extra oatmeal and left a bowl for me with a note. You don't have to eat alone. I stood in the kitchen holding that bowl like it was sacred. I'd eaten thousands of meals in silence, but this felt different. That one act of care opened something inside me, something I didn't know I'd locked away. I sat with Ruth that morning and listened as she told me, without details, that she had left a man who made her feel like dust. Her words weren't heavy, but they hung in the air like incense. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just spoke. And I realized then that surviving wasn't just about escaping. It was about sharing, about being witnessed. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep for the first time in 17 years. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and said out loud, to no one but the shadows, I'm still here. The sound of my own voice startled me. I hadn't spoken to myself in years. The next few weeks were slow, strange, and sacred. I went to group meetings where I sat with women who wore their pain in different colors, some loud, some quiet, all valid. We shared stories in pieces, like broken glass we were afraid to hand over. But every time someone opened up, we passed around invisible glue. I started writing again, not to hide this time, but to release. My journal filled with thoughts, confessions, questions. One entry read, I want to feel joy without fearing it will be taken. Another said, I wonder what my laughter sounds like. I began to notice things I never had before, how the light in the common room turned golden around 4 p.m., how the floor creaked near the coffee pot, how the night air smelled different when you weren't afraid. Slowly, I built routines. I made tea in the mornings, took walks around the block with Marcy, a single mom with 2 kids in another shelter. We didn't talk much, but we always held hands at the crosswalk. It felt like solidarity. I started therapy, real therapy, for the first time in my life. My therapist's name was Jordan, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that didn't flinch. She asked questions gently, never pushed. I remember the first time she asked me, what would it mean if it wasn't your fault? And I stared at her like she had spoken another language. Because for as long as I could remember, everything had been my fault. Every fight, every silence, every bruise that wasn't visible. I didn't know how to separate myself from the blame. But her question stuck to me like a seed. It didn't bloom right away, but it burrowed. And in the silence of the nights that followed, I began to water it. I started sleeping longer, deeper, not because I was healed, but because I finally felt safe enough to rest. One afternoon, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen mine. It startled me. It was high-pitched and awkward and beautiful. Ruth turned and said, "There it is." That's what I was waiting for. And I cried not from sadness, but from the realization that I could still laugh, that I hadn't lost everything. I began volunteering at a local bookshop, sorting returns, and making tea for the older customers. I was quiet but present. One of them, a woman named Gloria, called me Sunshine Girl because she said I had kind eyes. No one had called me anything kind in years. I took long showers in the shelter bathroom and cried because I could. Because no one was banging on the door. Because I could lock it and not fear what would be waiting on the other side. I wrote poems on sticky notes and left them around the house. "You're not broken," one said. "You're rebuilding." Another read, "Survival isn't shameful, it's sacred." The other one then began writing notes back. Our pain became poetry. Our healing became communion. I was 22 the first time I stood in front of the mirror, touched my own face, and whispered, "You're allowed to exist." And for once, I believed it. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew what it wouldn't include: silence, fear, apologies for breathing. The shelter gave me more than safety. It gave me my voice. It gave me community. It gave me a second chance at life. Not a perfect life, but a real one. And I knew with every part of me that I would spend the rest of my days helping others find the same. Because no one should have to cry themselves to sleep, and everyone deserves to wake up in peace. It happened quietly. Without warning, the day I stopped apologizing for breathing, and the strange part was, I didn't even realize I'd been doing it all my life. Apologizing with every step I took that wasn't silent enough, every word that felt too heavy, every time I took up space I thought didn't belong to me. Even in the shelter, even in safety, I still whispered when I spoke, still shrunk my shoulders when I entered a room, still waited for permission to exist. Until one Tuesday morning, the kind that feels like nothing, the kind no movie would ever show, gray sky, half a cup of cold tea, laundry tumbling in the dryer, and I heard myself say sorry when I passed someone in the hallway. I hadn't bumped them, hadn't interrupted them. Just existed near them, and I said it like it was second nature. Ruth was behind me, folding towels with her usual quiet grace, and without looking up she said, "You don't have to apologize for being alive, honey." And just like that, something cracked inside of me. A gentle, unexpected break, the kind that lets light through. I stood there for a full minute, heartbeat thudding in my ears, and I realized that word sorry had become a second skin. A shield, a reflex. I'd apologized for crying, for asking questions, for daring to hope, for not being enough, and for being too much. And suddenly, I didn't want to do it anymore. I walked back to my room and stared at the mirror, the one with a small chip in the corner and lipstick notes from other girls scribbled around the edges. Things like, "You are loved and your story matters." I took my own lipstick, trembling hand and all, and wrote, "I'm not sorry I'm here." I watched the words settle against the glass, and something inside me shifted. That night, I wrote for 3 hours straight. Pages and pages of memories. Pain, moments I hadn't allowed myself to remember. I wrote about the time I got a perfect score on my spelling test and no one noticed. The time I sang in the bathroom at 10 years old and my father yelled, "Shut up," so loud I never sang again. I wrote about the time I told my mother I had nightmares and she told me to be grateful I had a bed. I wrote about every time I cried and no one came. But I also wrote about that one time in 3rd grade when a teacher said I had beautiful handwriting, and I remembered how it made my chest flutter for a whole week. I wrote about the way Gloria at the bookstore smiled at me and told me she liked my eyes. I wrote about the laughter in the shelter kitchen, about the first time I painted my nails and didn't worry someone would grab my wrist and twist it. I wrote until my hand cramped and then I kept writing. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't poetic, but it was mine. And for the first time, my story wasn't hiding. I showed it to Jordan the next day in therapy. She didn't read it out loud. She just held it in her hands like it was a newborn, and she said, "This is where healing begins, not with answers, but with the courage to ask why." That line stayed with me for weeks. I began noticing how often the word sorry tried to slip. out of my mouth when I took too long in the shower, when I asked for seconds, when I laughed too loud. And every time I caught it, not always, but enough. One day I caught myself humming. In public, just a little tune under my breath while shelving books, and I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I didn't check to see if someone was watching. I just let it be. And it was the most radical thing I'd ever done. Later that week, I wore red lipstick for the first time. Not for anyone else, just for me. I didn't ask if it looked okay. I didn't hide behind a hoodie. I walked into group therapy and sat down with my back straight. Marcy said, "You look powerful." And I almost cried. Because for the first time in my life, I felt that way. The shelter manager offered me a part-time job helping new arrivals. I said yes without hesitation. I led orientation, gave them the tour, told them where the good towels were and which coffee mugs didn't burn your hand. But more than anything, I told them, you don't have to be sorry. Not here, not anymore. One of the new girls, barely 18, eyes like cracked glass, asked me if the nightmares would ever stop. I didn't lie. I said, maybe not. But one day you'll wake up and realize they're just memories, not monsters. She nodded. And I saw a little flicker in her chest, the same one I used to carry. A spark, a maybe, a what if. That night I didn't cry. I didn't even think about crying. I lay in bed with the window open, feeling the breeze, listening to the leaves rustle. And I whispered, "Thank you, universe, for not giving up on me when I gave up on myself." And I meant it. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for surviving, for being here, for taking up space. The girl who cried herself to sleep for years had found peace, not because everything was fixed, but because she was no longer hiding from herself. And that is where healing truly begins. It was late spring when I realized the shelter, that little old house with its peeling paint and creaky floors, had become something I never thought I'd find again. Home, not in the way people romanticize it. Not with candles and cozy furniture and holiday dinners. No, this was a quieter kind of home, a sacred one. One that smelled like strong coffee and laundry soap, where healing came in the form of sticky notes on mirrors and shared silence on the porch. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, the walls still echoed with someone else's nightmare, and sometimes the past would sneak up on us during dinner or while folding clothes. But there was a softness here, a gentleness in how we looked at each other. We never asked for details, we just gave space. And in that space, I grew. I remember standing at the kitchen sink one morning, hands in warm soapy water, sun streaming through the window, and I caught my reflection in the glass. It wasn't just that I looked different, it was that I looked present, grounded. There was a steadiness in my eyes I hadn't seen since I was a child. That was the day I whispered to myself, "This is home now." And I cried, not the shaking, gasping sobs I'd grown up with, but the soft, grateful tears that come when you finally exhale after holding your breath for a decade. I dried my hands and went to the common room where Ruth was reading and Marcy's daughter was coloring on the floor. I sat down beside them without a word, just sat there. And they didn't ask what was wrong. They didn't need to. They just made space. That afternoon, I joined a writing class at the local community center. I was terrified. My hand shook as I filled out the registration form. But I did it. The first class, I barely spoke, just listened. The second class, I read a poem, one of my mirror notes, reshaped and raw. When I finished, the room was quiet. Not uncomfortable, just still. And then a woman with a soft smile said, "That was brave." And I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was starting to live. I started walking with a straighter back, laughing louder, speaking my name without shrinking it. I stopped apologizing for crying, and I stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't, and the world didn't fall apart. In fact, it opened up. The bookstore offered me more hours. I started saving money, looking at studio apartments with uneven floors and too much charm. One night, I stayed up until 2 a.m. helping a new resident unpack her bag. She had nothing but a hoodie and a toothbrush. I gave her one of my sweaters. She cried. I didn't tell her it would be okay, because I knew it wouldn't feel okay for a while, but I told her she wasn't alone. And sometimes that's more powerful than any promise. Slowly, the house became more than just shelter. It became a sanctuary. We decorated for holidays. We made each other birthday cards. We even Had a makeshift family dinner every Friday, potluck style with laughter that echoed through the halls like a hymn. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the family I chose. One evening, as I sat on the porch with Ruth, sipping lukewarm tea, I said it out loud. I think I'm happy. She didn't say anything, just reached over and squeezed my hand. I don't think I'd ever said those words before. Not and meant them, not without doubt. But I meant them. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. The scars were still there. The nightmares still came sometimes. But I no longer let them define me. They were chapters, not the whole story. I was learning to be whole. And on the day I signed the lease for my own apartment, a tiny upstairs unit with creaky steps and a view of a parking lot, I walked back into the shelter one last time. I stood in the hallway, hand on the chipped doorframe, and whispered, "Thank you." Because that place didn't just give me safety, it gave me myself. And when I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I was carrying it with me. I still remember the sound the door made when it shut behind me, my new door in my new apartment, where no one else held the keys and no one else had ever raised their voice or their hand within those walls. It clicked shut with a soft finality, like the world was gently saying, "You're safe now." I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and thrift store furniture, my palms slightly sweating, heart racing with something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Mixed with panic, it was strange, the silence. At the shelter, there was always someone laughing in the hallway, footsteps creaking, the hum of other lives close by. Here, it was just me, and for a moment that scared me, not because I missed the noise, but because silence used to mean danger. Growing up, the quiet came before the storm. The silence meant someone was angry. It meant someone was hiding rage in the next room. But here in my little studio apartment with the uneven floorboards and mismatched dishes, the silence held no threat. It wrapped around me like a soft blanket instead of a cold warning. And yet my body didn't know how to believe that yet. I opened a window to let in the evening air, then sat on the floor because I hadn't bought chairs yet. I made tea with a borrowed kettle and curled up against the wall, knees hugged to my chest. It was in that moment that the tears came, not sobs. Just quiet, steady tears that dripped down my cheeks like a blessing. I wasn't crying from fear. I was crying because I had never felt this kind of stillness before. I lit a candle, lavender scent, soft flame, and watched it flicker in the quiet. That tiny flame felt like my life, delicate, fragile, but finally protected from the wind. That night, I slept on a mattress on the floor with only a thin blanket, a borrowed pillow, and the soft hum of city life outside my window, and I slept. Deeply, without flinching, without checking the locks more than once, without tensing at every creak in the hallway. For the first time in decades, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I simply closed my eyes and drifted. The next morning, I woke with sunlight in my hair and the realization that I had made it through the night, alone and unafraid. I walked barefoot to the window, opened the curtain, and whispered to no one I did it. I made breakfast, eggs and toast, and burnt coffee, and ate sitting on a box labeled books. I smiled to myself when I realized I had nowhere to be, no one to answer to, no one to fear. I decided to make this place mine. I hung the sticky notes from the shelter mirror on my new one, the ones that said, "You are enough," and "You made it out." I painted the kitchen wall pale blue and cried when the first coat went on because it felt like reclaiming something. I didn't have much, some secondhand dishes, a tiny bookshelf, 2 plants I named Grace and Hope, but I had air. I had space, I had choice. And in every quiet hour, I built something inside myself. I wrote poems again. I started sharing them online. People commented, "I feel this," and this saved me. And it hit me. My pain had become someone else's. Permission to heal. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was giving meaning to the survival. That first month was a mosaic of small victories. I cooked my own meals. I danced to music at midnight. I laughed at reruns. I read books that made me feel seen. I took long showers with no one banging on the door. I bought myself flowers, bright yellow daisies, and wrote a note that said, "From me to the girl who never thought she'd get here." The healing didn't erase the past. There were still nights when old memories scratched at the door of my mind. But now I knew how to soothe them. I'd light that same lavender candle, take a deep breath, and remind myself, this is not then. This is now, and now I am safe. I'm free, I'm alive. That's how I learned the truth. Healing isn't a finish line. It's a soft return to yourself, one deep breath at a time. And that night, my first night alone, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I slept in peace. Real peace. The kind one built brick by brick, tear by tear, breath by breath. It had been almost a year since I left the shelter when I stood in front of a room full of strangers. Heart thudding in my chest, palms damp, voice stuck somewhere between fear and freedom, and finally, for the first time in my life, I told the truth out loud. I was at a local open mic night, the kind that welcomed poetry, music, monologues, pain, really disguised in art. I hadn't planned to go up. I went to support a girl I met in writing class. But when they announced there was time for one more speaker and no one moved, something inside me did. It wasn't courage, it was something deeper. A quiet voice inside that whispered, "It's time." I stood, legs shaky, hands gripping a folded piece of paper, the poem I had written the night before, when I woke up from a dream that felt like childhood knocking one last time. I walked to the front, not knowing if my knees would hold. The mic was too tall. The host adjusted it. I looked at the crowd, maybe 30 people, mostly kind eyes and open postures, but I wasn't seeing them. I was seeing my father's chair, my mother's back turned in the kitchen, the hallway where I learned to be invisible. And I said, "My name is Lena. This is called The Girl in the Quiet Room." My voice cracked on the second line, but no one laughed. No one looked away. I kept reading, each word like a release, each pause like a wound finally closing. I spoke about crying myself to sleep, about how silence became a language I mastered. I spoke about the weight of blame that was never mine, about how it felt to sleep in peace for the first time. I didn't say their names. I didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming. When I finished, I stood there, waiting for the ground to open up. Instead, there was silence, the good kind, and then applause. Not polite, not obligatory, warm, real. I stepped off the stage and someone hugged me before I even got back to my seat. They whispered, "Thank you, I needed that." I sat down and cried, not from shame, but from the sheer power of being heard. That night, something changed. It wasn't just that I had told my story, it was that I had owned it. It was mine now, not something done to me. Something I had risen from. I started performing more after that, not often. Not loudly, but with presence, with honesty. I shared poems, letters, short stories that came from the same place inside me that used to only know how to scream in silence. And people responded. They came up after readings and said things like, "That was me," or "I've never told anyone, but..." And I realized the truth. Telling your story doesn't just heal you, it invites others to heal too. One day, a girl about 19 came up to me, eyes rimmed in tears. She whispered, "I didn't know anyone else felt like this. I thought I was broken." And I held her hand and said, "You're not broken. You're brave." That's when I decided to start writing publicly. I launched a small blog, nothing fancy, just words. Raw and imperfect. I called it The Quiet Room because that's where I found myself. The posts were honest, sometimes messy, sometimes poetic, always true. I wrote about the first time. I laughed and didn't feel guilty. The first time I turned off my phone without fear. The first time I looked in a mirror and didn't look away. Slowly, people started reading, subscribing, commenting. One woman said she printed out a post and kept it on her fridge because it helped her stay alive. I read that and cried for hours. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood. The power of truth, not the shiny social media truth, but the raw kind. The kind you earn through fire. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, tea in one hand, pen in the other, and I wrote a line I'll never forget. I used to think my story was a secret. Now I know it's a lantern. That night, I slept with the window open, stars overhead, and no fear in my chest. I didn't cry, I didn't flinch. I just breathed deeply, freely, because I had finally spoken the truth, and the world didn't end. In fact, it opened. It had been almost 2 years since I'd left the house I once called home, the house where my voice had been silenced, where my tears had soaked into pillows I never dared to wash, where survival had felt like a curse instead of a victory. And just when I thought I had found my footing, when my mornings felt light and my nights felt safe, my past knocked on my door. Literally. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen, my playlist humming low in the background, sunlight falling. Across my little bookshelf when someone knocked. Not hard, not urgent, just there. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the peephole and froze. It was my mother. My heart stopped. I hadn't seen her since the day I left. She hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't reached out. Not once. I stared at her through the glass, older, thinner maybe, holding her purse like it was armor. My hand shook as I unlocked the door. I opened it slowly, like my healing might break if the wind shifted wrong. "Hi," she said. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "Can I come in?" And just like that, every memory came flooding. Back, her silence, her dismissiveness, the way she used to pretend nothing was happening even when I was bleeding inside. I wanted to say no. I wanted to slam the door and protect the peace I had so carefully built. But part of me, the part that still longed to be understood, opened the door wider and nodded. She stepped inside, eyes scanning the space like she was searching for proof that I was okay. "This is nice," she said, her voice uncertain. I didn't respond. I sat on the couch and waited. She didn't sit. She stood, holding herself, like she might unravel if she relaxed. Finally, she spoke. "I heard about your writing, Ruth from the shelter. Sent me a link." That surprised me. "I didn't know they'd stayed in touch." "I didn't know how to reach you," she added. "Didn't think you wanted to hear from me." I stayed silent, because she was right. I hadn't. She looked down, twisting her fingers. "I read." "Your story," she said. "All of it." My breath caught. "You were so little, and I didn't protect you." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. My mother had never admitted anything. Not once, not even when I begged her to believe. Me. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know how to leave him, and I told myself you were okay. I told myself you were strong." My throat burned. "I was a child," I said. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know." The room was quiet for a long time. I stared at the wall, unable to look at her. Then, softly, she said, "I'm sorry." 2 words, so late, so long overdue. And yet, they cracked something open. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't the mother I'd wished for, but maybe. Maybe she was trying. "Why are you here?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Because I wanted you to know. That I believe you, and I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I wasn't the mother you needed." A tear slid down my cheek. Not because I believed her fully, but because those words had lived only in my dreams. We talked for a while about small things, about the job she'd taken, about my blog, about Ruth. She didn't stay long. As she got up to leave, she paused by the door. "I know I don't deserve a place in your life," she said, "but if you ever want to talk, I'd like to try." I nodded, not a yes, but not a no. And when the door closed behind her, I stood in the stillness of my home and breathed. I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel pulled back. I felt rooted, grounded, because her visit didn't undo my healing. It didn't shake the foundation I'd built. It reminded me that the past will always be a part of me, but it doesn't own me anymore. That night, I lit my candle, sipped my tea, and wrote, "Today I faced the past," and didn't flinch. I slept with the window open again, and I didn't cry. I didn't fear. I just dreamed. I never thought I'd let anyone love me again. Not really. Not deeply. I believed for the longest time that love was just another word for control. Another doorway to pain. That love came with conditions, with fear, with walking on eggshells. I thought being alone was safer, and in many ways it was. Alone meant peace. Alone meant safety. But alone, I started to wonder, was I keeping people out or was I keeping myself in? It started with someone I met at the bookstore. His name was Eli, quiet, gentle, always reading the same kind of dog-eared poetry books I loved. At first, we spoke in fragments, small talk, shared laughter, eye contact that lingered too. Long and then darted away. He never asked too much. He never invaded my space. He just showed up. Once he brought me a cup of tea when he noticed I was having a rough morning. Didn't ask what was wrong. Just said, "Thought you might need." This, and something inside me softened. I started to look forward to our conversations. They were light but real. And slowly, I found myself telling him small pieces of my truth, not the whole story. Not yet, but enough to see how he handled it. And he didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't run, he just listened. And one day, as we were walking after work, he said, "You don't have to be anyone else with me." And I stopped in my tracks, because I didn't know what that felt like. I'd spent my life adjusting myself, shrinking myself, hiding the scars, and now someone was offering me space to just be. Still, I hesitated. I pulled back. For weeks, I avoided anything that felt like a beginning, because beginnings meant I could lose again. But Eli was patient. He never pushed. He showed up with books he thought I'd like, notes tucked inside pages that said things like, "This line made me think of you." He laughed at my awkward jokes. He listened when I talked about my writing. And one day I found myself inviting him into my home. It wasn't a big moment, no candlelight, no music, just us sitting on my couch, tea between us, and silence that didn't feel heavy. He looked around at my little space, the mirror with the sticky notes, the bookshelf I built myself, the lavender candle I always lit before bed, and he said, "This place feels like you." And I smiled, because it did. We didn't fall in love quickly. We grew into it, carefully, like planting a garden in soil you're still learning to trust. There were moments I panicked when he touched my hand and I flinched, not because he hurt me, but because my body still didn't know what it was like to be touched gently. There were nights I cried after you left, not because he did anything wrong, but because I didn't know how to believe someone could care without expecting something in return. But Eli stayed. Quietly, respectfully, lovingly, and little by little. I let him in. I told him the truth. All of it. The childhood, the violence, the silence, the shelter, the first night I slept in peace. I braced myself for pity, for distance, for discomfort. But he just held my hand and said, "You are not your past, but you are so strong because of it." And in that moment, I realized I was finally allowing myself to be loved, not because I needed saving, but because I had saved myself, and I was ready for someone to meet me where I stood. Our love wasn't loud. It wasn't a movie. It was slow mornings and thoughtful texts and walks that didn't need words. It was trust built over time, like a bridge that no longer creaked when I stepped across. And for the first time in my life, love didn't hurt. Love didn't scare me. Love didn't ask me to be smaller. It asked me to be honest. One night, as we sat on my porch, stars above, tea in hand, I said it first. "I love you." My voice shook, but I said it. And he looked at me like I was the entire night sky. "I love you too," he said. "All of you." And I believed him. Not because he promised forever, but because he showed up again and again with softness, with patience, with the kind of love that doesn't try to fix what isn't. Broken, that night I slept with his arm around me, my lavender candle flickering beside us, and no fear in my chest. I didn't cry, I didn't doubt, I just slept. And for the first time, I dreamed of a future I wasn't afraid to want. It had been 3 years since I left that house, 2 years since I found peace, and a little over 1 year since I learned how to let love in when the invitation arrived. It was an email, simple subject line, "Keynote Opportunity Survivors. United Annual Conference." I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. They'd read my blog. They'd heard me speak once through a local podcast and wanted me to open the national event. Not as a guest, not as a panelist. As the keynote speaker, me. The girl who once cried herself to sleep every night. The woman who used to think silence was survival. I stared at the screen, hands shaking. My first instinct was to say no. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to be seen like that. But then I remembered something Ruth once told me: you don't have to be fully healed to stand tall. You just have to stand. So I said, yes. I spent weeks preparing. I rewrote my speech 10 times. Practiced in front of a mirror. Recorded myself on my phone and deleted it. I cried at least 4 times. But I kept going. Eli encouraged me every step of the way. He didn't try to write the speech for me. He just listened. Held my hand when the nightmares returned. Whispered, "You've already lived the hardest part. This is just telling the truth." The day of the event, I stood backstage in a blazer I bought secondhand. Palms sweating, heart pounding, breath caught somewhere between terror and triumph. The room was huge, rows and rows of chairs, faces I didn't know yet already loved. Mostly women, some men, all survivors. All fighters. When they called my name, my knees almost buckled. But I stepped forward. Not because I wasn't scared. I was terrified, but because I had something to say. The lights blinded me. The microphone felt too tall again. But I took a breath, looked out at the crowd, and started, "My name is Lena," and for the longest time I believed I was invisible. The room went still, silent. I continued. I spoke of the little girl who tiptoed around broken glass and louder. Tempers, the teenager who believed love meant pain. The young woman who hid in a shelter, afraid of her own voice. I spoke of healing, not the pretty kind, but the kind that hurts before it helps. I told them about the first night I slept alone and didn't cry. The first time I said I love you without apologizing for it. I told them about forgiveness, how it's not about letting someone back in, but letting the hurt out. I didn't use big words. I didn't try to sound like a hero. I just told the truth, and when I finished, the room stood, one by one. Applause echoing like thunder. But what hit me hardest weren't the claps. It was the faces. Tears, smiles, women holding each other's hands. I stepped off stage, and people lined up just to say thank you. One woman clutched a crumpled tissue and said, "Your story gave me the courage to leave." Another said, "I thought I was crazy. You helped me feel sane." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was leading. I was shining a light. Not because I wanted attention, but because my story had become someone else's flashlight in the dark. That night, I returned home, kicked off my shoes, sat on the floor of my apartment, the same one that once held my fear, and cried again. Not from pain, from awe. I wrote in my journal, I spoke my truth. The world didn't just hear me, it healed with me. Eli wrapped his arms around me. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. And for the first time, I didn't deflect. I just smiled and said, "Me too." I didn't sleep much that night. My heart was too full. I sat by the window watching the city lights, and I whispered to the girl I used to be, "You made it. You're free. And now you're lighting the way for others." I slept in peace, not just because I was safe, but because I had become the safety I always longed for. It wasn't planned. I didn't wake up one day and say, "Today I'll go back." But healing has a way of leading you to the places you once feared, just to show you how far you've come. It was a quiet Saturday, sky overcast, breeze cool against my face. I was visiting a nearby town for a writing workshop when I saw the street sign, Ashwood Lane, the road that led to the house I had once called home, the one that had both raised me and broken me. I don't know what pulled me there. Maybe closure, maybe curiosity, maybe both. I parked a few blocks away. I walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, but not because of fear, because of memory. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. The same rusted fences, the same crooked mailbox, and then there it was, the house. Smaller than I remembered, quiet, still. The paint was chipped, the yard unkempt. Time had touched it, but time had touched me too. I stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in my coat pockets, staring at the window where I once looked out and dreamed of escape. I half expected to feel panic, to feel that old weight press against my chest, but instead I felt peace. Not joy, not nostalgia, but calm, like standing in front of a grave you no longer cry at because you've already mourned everything you lost. I didn't go inside, I didn't need to. This place no longer held me. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You don't own me anymore." Then I turned around and started walking away, but not before looking back one last time, and I smiled. Because that house didn't break me, it shaped me. And now I was no longer the scared girl hiding in corners. I was a woman who had survived, spoken, loved, and lived. A woman who had taken every shattered piece of herself and built something whole. When I got home that evening, Eli was waiting with dinner and a quiet understanding. I didn't have to explain where I'd been. He could see it in my eyes. I had closed a chapter. That night, we sat on the porch, stars overhead, no words needed. Just silence, the good kind, the kind that wraps around you like peace. I lit my lavender candle, wrote the final entry in my journal, and signed it with my full name. Not the name they used to shout in anger. The name I chose for myself. The name that belonged to the woman I had become. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And for the first time in my life, I believed it completely. I crawled into bed, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and smiled. Into the darkness. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally whole. I slept that night, not because I was tired, but because I was free.